Welcome to the first of what will be two Earnscliffe webinars on COP26, the climate change negotiations happening in Glasgow right now, running through to the 12th of November. My name is Allan Gregg. I'm a principal who works out of the Toronto office of Earnscliffe Strategies. I'm joined by three of my colleagues. Velma McColl is been a longtime Earnscliffean, is a lead expert in environment and climate change policy in our practice, and in addition was the co-founder of the Canadian Clean Technology Coalition and Women in Government Relations. Rick Anderson works out of our Vancouver office, expert in almost everything, but in particularly energy policy. Through his entire adult life, he has been an advisor to prime ministers, premiers, kings, and princesses. He's a fountain of knowledge. And last but certainly not least, one of relatively new additions to Earnscliffe, Bud Locklear. Before joining the firm, Bud was a special advisor for environment and energy in the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa. So two of you are actually at the conference right now. So Velma and Rick, I want you to just very briefly give us a sense. I mean, what are you seeing? What are you hearing? What's the mood there right now, Velma?
Well, we're in day 4. The first 2 days were with world leaders. It's the largest number of world leaders that have ever attended a COP. They haven't been here since Paris, when the Paris Agreement was signed. So we had statements from 130 world leaders from around the country. And so they came forward because, as everyone knows, the Paris Agreement is an agreement that moves people to make commitments for their individual countries and then to report out on those. So the last 2 days have been about presidents, prime ministers, leaders of countries from around the world saying what they have been doing for the last 5 years since Paris and what they intend to do. And frankly, one of the things that we're going to talk about is whether they're intending to hit net zero by 2050. Some people are saying 2060 or 2070, but yes, it was a reporting out the last 2 days, and a lot of meetings at the very high level. They started out in Rome talking about climate change, and then they came here to Glasgow and had the same conversation.
Rick, you sent a note the other day to your fellow colleagues saying that that you're feeling pretty positive. You actually think there's a chance that the yardsticks might move forward. Is that a general sentiment there right now?
It depends who you ask, of course, Alan, but yes, I think so. And it's partly because of what Velma was just referring to. I mean, this COP isn't just a 2-week meeting. It's actually been a process that's been going on for the better part of a year. And there's been a lot of intense work done during the lead up to this. I mean, starting with President Biden shortly after being inaugurated, bringing the United States back into COP and convening a world leaders session where he, this is back in April, jollied everybody up to increase their goals, to increase their ambitions, which worked for Canada, worked for the States, worked for a bunch of other countries, and led to us submitting our revised targets in July as a country. And many other countries have been doing the same thing. So we knew all along that things were getting more in terms of the goals. But meanwhile, the UK presidency of the COP, the hosts, along with the UN, have had not just a couple of meetings, but actually a series of 4 meetings since the spring, preparing the agenda and working on consensus and framing things and so on. So there's only a few issues that really are subject to negotiation here, like the Paris rule book, including what's called Article 6. We'll get to that. But we've seen a lot of the content already previewed before the meeting, and now it's unfolding as previewed. So there's been a lot of momentum building going into this conference, and that's why people are so upbeat as it enters its 3rd or 4th day now.
I should have mentioned right off the top that there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Anyone who is tuned in to listen to the conversation should feel free to pose a question either to an individual panelist or the panel as a whole. Bud, because he's the new guy, we always make the new guy do this, is forced to monitor this, and I'll turn to him at a number of different times over the course of the conversation, and we'll get questions from the viewers. I want to get to Bud, but first, very quickly, just for those who don't follow the file as closely as you do, very quickly, Velma, who's there from the Canadian delegation, the official delegation?
Minister Guilbeault is here, Minister Wilkinson, Minister Freeland, they're all here. They're having a variety of bilateral meetings. Minister Guilbeault at Environment and Climate Change will be the head of delegation. It's Finance Day in Glasgow here, and
Today,
Minister
yeah.
Wilkinson has led an initiative which we'll talk a little bit more about, but today is his day along with Mark Carney. After ministers, after leaders leave, then the ministers get down to work. And I just want to say one thing, which is what we see, what Rick described is really because we've moved into an era of something I would call climate diplomacy, where you see foreign ministers, environment ministers, natural resource ministers, finance ministers, trade ministers. You see a wide range in each country's delegation of who's here.
Not just the environmental ministers.
It's not just
anymore.
the environment minister. It's much broader, and many of the things that are being negotiated would have implications across the government. So this is not a narrow.
There's a lot of the private sector and civil society there. Who's there from Canada, and more to the point, why are they there?
Well, there's people here from industry, of course, from most of the various energy sectors: electricity, nuclear, wind, solar, oil, gas. You see people, hydrogen. You see people there from all of those sectors. The environmental groups from Canada and from around the world are here. There's about 100, or I'm guessing, Velma, you might know better than me, about 100 other Canadians. Some of them are part of the official Canadian government delegation, and some of them come through an NGO channel like I do, through the UN process itself as part of their outreach. There's youth people.
Are they lobbying the process, or are they just, what are they doing?
They have side meetings, they have days, they have theme days. There's all kinds of, while the main sessions are going on, there's all kinds of other side meetings going on. You can't keep up with it all. There's hundreds of meetings that are going on in parallel to this, some on the same site and in various rooms, at the same site. It's a huge site, and some scattered all over the city. So there's premiers here. There's 2 premiers here. Quebec has got a very large delegation here. So there's a ton of people here, and what's happening is that, as you were just saying, the interest is going out of the environmental sphere and into the industry and business sphere, and also now, thanks to the effort of Mark Carney, into the investment community, which is the theme of today's particular theme of the conference.
I want to get to that, but I also want to bring Bud in here, because welcome to Earnscliffe, Bud, by the way. Trying to get a word in edgewise. We got lots of good talkers in our organization. I mean, a lot of people who are following this file saw the election of Joe Biden and conversely the defeat of Donald Trump as a real game changer. I mean, Biden himself has said the United States is back at the table, prepared to take a leadership role in global environmental policy. We saw yesterday they just rejoined what was it called, the High Ambition Coalition. Talk to me about the United States' role and whether it has the potential to significantly alter the deliberations and the outcome of this conference.
Sure. Thanks, Allan. So 100%, when the Biden administration came in, climate diplomacy, heightened ambition were number one, top priority issues for the administration. And I think emblematic of that was naming John Kerry, former Secretary of State, as his special presidential advisor for climate, whose role was to go out and do that diplomatic, outward-facing effort. And he named Gina McCarthy, the former EPA administrator, as the domestic climate czar, the national climate coordinator, trying to herd the cats of the executive branch into making change and moving in the right direction. That Leaders Summit on Climate that Rick mentioned a few moments ago, held in April on Earth Day, was part of the plan of this administration to raise ambition, to get an early start on the Glasgow meeting by having that meeting in April, getting countries to primed, and subsequently to lay the groundwork for even more countries to lay out more ambitious NDCs. And to an extent that worked. I mean, as just in the last few days, the count was in 119 countries have produce new NDCs. And of those, many of them are improved NDCs. And something like 21 countries plus the EU have made some significant emitters have made substantial more ambitious.
Velma, how many of these global conferences have you attended?
10.
10
over 20 years.
Since my understanding is since 2005, the total amount of global emissions virtually has not changed. What's been accomplished in that time that you've been going to these conferences on the climate file?
Well, I mean, we've been, total emissions have moved around, but we bent the curve because at the same time our economies have been growing. We've been doing other
the
kinds
output
of
is up,
things.
but emissions are flat.
So we've capped, and now the job is to make that curve go like that. And 2020 to 2030 is 10 years of accelerated ambition. The UN through the SDGs are pushing this. So there's all kinds of efforts. The other thing is that I think this is a COP where we're finally in a position to start addressing implementation, because it took until Paris to put the building blocks together. Now we're seeing very significant investments in technologies in a couple of the days here, not just technology as a escape hatch, but technology as the way that we're going to transform energy, transportation, buildings, all the things that we need to transform to live in a net zero world.
I just want to
also say really quickly that there's a huge global indigenous contingent here. There's all kinds of cultural groups, religious organizations, labor, cities are here in force as they were in Paris, bringing their message as an organizing unit of how we're going to address climate change.
You had something to say, Rick?
I was just going to say the reason I'm here, and it's my first, I was never particularly hugely drawn to coming to a COP in the past because I saw it too much as a goal setting exercise that wasn't backed up by real plans at home. And what's different now, what I think has changed, and that's why I'm here. I came because I think it was changing, and what I'm seeing here is reaffirming that more governments are more seriously, including Canada at the forefront, by the way, developing concrete plans and putting serious policy now, serious carbon pricing, like we tripled it last December. And so more countries are getting serious about it. It's becoming actually a real thing.
Well, among the change, I mean, you've told us many times, your colleagues here, that there's been a huge evolution in the thinking and the posture of the private sector, the energy sector. Talk to me about that.
Well, the most important thing is that the leaders, by which I mean the innovators and the visionaries in the business, including some of the biggest energy companies in Canada and around the world, have started to see this as opportunity rather than threat. They've started to understand what it means when people say, let's shift to a different energy mix, let's shift to a lower emission energy mix. It means that we're going to start harnessing things like carbon capture, hydrogen, blending biofuels. And all of those things are things that people are thinking now of investing in. If you're at the head of a big electricity company, you're getting ready for the tripling of electricity demand that is inherent in the plans that we're talking about. If you're the head of a big oil and gas company, you're trying to figure out, you're turning to your people and you're saying, give me our best ideas for how to reduce our emissions so that we get onto a curve, which the biggest energy companies in Canada have pledged themselves to net zero emissions by 2050. That's only 29 years. That's not a very long time in this context of energy infrastructure. And so all through the business community and the energy sectors in particular, but also the big users of energy like heavy industry and steel refining and so on, they're all saying, okay, so how do we get our emissions down? Because we now got a law in Canada, one of our raised commitments, that says we're going to be at net zero emissions in 2050, 29 years. And that means every sector basically has to do that. Agriculture.
And by and large, the private sector has bought in. It's no longer kind of an us, them, kill the bills posture that we saw so much historically.
It's a spectrum, Alan. But that's the change that's going on. And the people who are, if you're in charge of one of these companies, your board of directors and your shareholders are saying, how are you going to be in business 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And you're having to come up with those plans. If you're not doing that, if you're just sitting there saying, I don't need to make these changes, I don't believe this is necessary, I don't think this is serious, you're going to end up being roadkill. And your shareholders are increasingly becoming aware of that.
But the G20 countries represent 80% of global emissions. They just met in Rome before heading off to Glasgow. And many, including the President of the United States, said that they were disappointed with the climate portion of the final communique. Why disappointment? And what does that portend for the outcome of this conference?
Well, the lack of ambition, the lack of commitment to ambition is key. That was what President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau and others on the progressive side of things wanted to achieve in Italy. And the fact is the G20 is made up of a disparate group of countries, Mexico in particular being one that is not particularly interested in a critical approach to addressing climate change. So they couldn't end up where they wanted to, but that was one landing point, I guess stepping stone on the way to COP26. So less concerned that didn't end up exactly hitting it out of the park, but with hope that the momentum that's coming from other forces is going to carry on into Glasgow.
And it's an arm twisting exercise, right? I mean, the 20 countries get together and they try to isolate the 3 or 4 who are lagging behind the others: China, India, Russia, Australia. And you see Australia came here and said, okay, net zero 2050. But we don't know about our new more ambition for 2030. So they're kind of getting there. But that's the process. So increasingly, things like what you just asked about, the G20 meeting a couple of days ago in Rome, are about the shrinking number of countries that are not part of the program.
Well,
I want to
and
talk
today,
about
look,
that
today
divide
on,
at some length. But I mean, do we have any questions from the viewers that you want to pose to anyone?
Let me throw. Sorry, Velma, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, just let me say really quickly that today on Finance Day is a perfect day to underline what's different about that, because we have initiatives going on in both public and private finance. So public finance is trying to marshal $100 billion a year so that global north and global south can move to low carbon realities at the same pace, and that adaptation can be dealt with. The private finance piece, Mark Carney is leading an initiative under the UN that would have us see $130 trillion in private sector investment mobilized against carbon. And not just that's an initiative, but that the risk portion of it, there will also be a stick portion to that says to people who are investing, actually, there are consequences if we don't start to move together to invest in the change. So it's no longer just governments, it's governments and finance that are going to move to start to really change the conversation.
Bud, any questions from viewers there that you want to put forward?
Yeah, this fits in pretty nicely with what Velma just mentioned, and it's from Frank McShane in Calgary. He asks, what's the response to Prime Minister Trudeau's call for a global carbon tax and carbon pricing over in Glasgow?
Well, why don't we go around the horn? Is that going to fly, Rick?
I think that's going to take a long time. It's the right idea. And more people are nodding their heads and saying that. There was a session this morning where, a pretty significant group of leaders from around the world, including the heads of the EU and so on, were nodding their heads about it. Obviously, it's bad. There's some synchronization here because there's a problem we call leakage in the industry, in the environmental policy world, which is if I have a carbon price or regulation that says this in order to achieve emission reduction, and a company moves that production from next door to another province or a state or a country or whatever, and does the same thing as they were going to do there. I've just had leakage of employment and economic growth in my part of the world for no particular gain, no gain environmentally. So that's a bad thing. So harmonizing these things is the right idea. People are starting to talk about border carbon adjustments, which are a clunky exercise, but is designed to protect against that. And it could end up being kind of a very protectionist kind of thing, which would be a negative, I think. And the better answer is what the questioner is asking about, which is either a common price or at least a common system of applying prices.
Let me steer that question back to Bud, because I mean, one of the countries that isn't particularly excited about the prospect of pricing carbon or having a carbon tax is the United States.
Nationally.
Given that they're our greatest trading partner, and as Rick just suggested, there's a competitive issue associated with embedding carbon pricing in the production of export goods. Why is the States not particularly enthusiastic about this?
Look, a tax, no matter what it's supposed to do, is sort of politically very difficult in the United States. So a carbon price, there's actually been some bills in this most recent Congress suggesting a carbon price that would be connected with a carbon border adjustment. Those are not going anywhere. The administration has a social cost of carbon they're using to map policies, right? And what that would, the benefit that would bring, but it's not an explicit carbon price. But a lot of people do seem to think that, yeah, it's an eventuality, but if COP26 doesn't deliver and we move into more of the trade war world towards a low carbon future, what we're going to see probably is CBAMs somehow implemented in the United States even before an explicit pricing, which is a hard thing to get your head around, but it's a long haul.
Velma, I want to bring you in on this as well. I mean, someone said that, that Prime Minister Trudeau is advocating this because it's the one area where Canada really has shown some leadership with a promise to go up to $170 a ton. Is he actively lobbying other leaders? I know he's gone now, but I mean, is this something that Canada really wants to advance on a global stage?
He is. And I mean, some of this is about a price on carbon because Canada was among the first to move to a price on carbon. And we have different systems of setting that price. We have OBPS, output-based pricing systems. So we have that, and we have tax, and we have people who feed into an emissions trading system. So yes, we have more practice at it. We've seen the benefits. We see how it's a necessary tool in the toolkit. 17% of global emissions are covered by a carbon price right now. The target of that group is to move to 60%. It's going to take a long time. This is where we get the tension between domestic politics and international objectives. And so we know what it took. Gordon Campbell did it in British Columbia, and we know what kind of a political hit he took here to do that, but he started a ball that kept rolling in Canada, and now we have that at the federal level. And we have a way of working that out so provincial jurisdictions can do what is best in their jurisdiction. That's a political road that every individual country is going to have to walk for us to get to this. But there is a recognition that carbon pricing is an extremely efficient mechanism to reduce emissions. It's not the silver bullet, it's not everything, but it is a tool that's useful. And that's basically what the Prime Minister is saying to other countries, is that China saw the sense of it and got on board. Other countries will. I hear Bud on the US. We know how many bills have gone before, how many political careers and hours in Congress have been spent debating this. Whether the US is going to get there or not, I don't know. And that's why border carbon adjustments are also being discussed here.
Rick, we've noted that today is Finance Day. Velma raised the notion that Mark Carney is there front and center. Canada's Mark Carney with his Glasgow Financial Alliance for net zero, with the potential to invest, I think it's $4 trillion a year in mitigation projects and policy. You talked about how the boards of directors of the private sector, especially the energy companies, are sitting and looking and expecting some sustainability figures there. Talk to me how important financing is, and especially private sector financing is, in the total climate change solution mix.
Well, it's huge, because it's what we're talking about is obviously very expensive. I referred to tripling the size of our electricity capacity in the world, which is necessary because electrification, clean electrification, is really the basis of a lot of the energy transition that we're talking about, and the costs of that are quite significant. So one of the first enablers that is moving the dial in this area is the whole concept of net zero 2050, which says to people in the business community and the investment community, they're serious about this now. They're prepared to have us invest in projects with a 30-year life cycle, 30-year lifespan, instead of running around doing everything like it's a 5-alarm fire and we have by the day after tomorrow, or else the world's going to come to an end. So what can I do about that? Now with Net Zero 2050, business people and investment markets are awakening to, okay, so the transition here now has got a time frame that we can deal with. Mark Carney steps in at the invitation of the United Nations and the UK host, the UK presidents of this conference, and he galvanizes what's become a couple of hundred, 450, I guess they said this morning, financial institutions, institutional investors, banks, and so on, lenders around the world who have pledged to align their investment practices with the goal of net zero. And that means two things. People think it's only about the investment side of it, but we're going to free up maybe $4 trillion a year of investment in this area. But it also means they're going to stop, or they're going to slow down at the beginning and eventually stop investing in things that are hampering the progress towards net 20. It's also a disinvestment aspect. So they're really talking about shifting over the 30-year cycle here that we're talking about $120 trillion from emission-intense investments to low emission or zero emission investments. And that frees up a huge amount of capital. I mean, we're talking about governments helping each other, governments of the wealthy nations helping developing countries manage the energy transition and adaptation in their countries. That's about $100 billion a year. The private sector money that Carney and now Michael Bloomberg are working together on is $4 trillion a year.
It's remarkable. I can see both. You know, if you were behind the curve in terms of your emissions, you'd have your finger between your neck and your collar, and if you were ahead of it, you'd be rubbing your hands with glee. I mean, that's fascinating.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, this has to do with carbon disclosure, and I want to kind of put a plug in for Canada's, because Canada has been tracking on climate finance for a while, and particularly around these mechanisms. We have some great thinking coming out of our universities, including there at Queen's. So there's a lot of good stuff happening in Canada on how to figure this out.
But we talked a little bit about the tension between those who see themselves as, you know, fully ambitious on this file and those they like to position as a laggard. We talked about the United States being back at the table. I mean, Biden's green plan has pretty much been gutted by Congress, especially as it relates to the elimination of the use of coal as a fuel source. How much does that undermine the United States leadership position? And do you expect them to start getting some pushback from countries like China and Russia that they kind of finger point at quite regularly?
Well, without a doubt, you know, in the geopolitical world, yes, Russia and China use these sorts of perceived inability to push things through in a democracy as evidence of lack of will. The problem right now is that the relationship with China is tense on many fronts: the geopolitical issue, the climate issue, and I think unfortunately what that's doing is making countries that may be thinking they want to attain, you know, the wealth of China using the China growth paradigm, maybe they're not so interested in signing up to an aggressive climate mitigation program led by the United States. So there's some difficulties there. The U.S. is definitely facing that, and those are going to be persistent problems. There's not going to be an ability to get regulation through. The conservative judiciary might be stopping things. The division within the Democratic Party itself, not even talking about the difference between Democrats and Republicans, means that you can't push things forward. Now, I think actually there's a bit of a silver lining for Canada here. Canada's great progress, carbon pricing, institutionalizing that through the Supreme Court case. The fact that Mark Carney, a Canadian, and Minister Wilkinson, Canadian minister, are spearheading the two tracks of climate finance, I think raises Canada's profile enormously. And I think one of the questions we have from the Bureau is, well, you know, what is the Prime Minister's role, and is he making an impact? I think he is. I think he's making a great impact with the help of the high-profile Canadian efforts on the finance side. And the finance side, as Rick said, is key to something real coming out of this.
When we talked about the Prime Minister advocating for a carbon pricing, and also right out of the gate, he announced that we were going to place a cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector. Is this a big deal? Is this a big development, or is this just kind of an expected continuation of the total plan we've been seeing unfold over the last 2 years out of Canada?
Well, it's the second time he said it that way. The first time was actually during the election campaign when he said almost word for word what he announced on Monday here in Glasgow. But it also follows from the net zero legislation which Parliament adopted in June. You know, if the entire economy is going to net zero by 2050, you can hardly expect the oil and gas industry not to be on a similar curve one way or another. I mean, there's no way for the entire country of Canada to have net zero emissions in 2050 and the oil and gas industry still be pumping out 190 megatons a year of emissions. So, I mean, implicit in that legislation is that basically every sector is going to have to come up with its own plans. Every company is going to have to come up with its own plans. Every province is going to have to come up with its own plans to achieve net zero. I mean, that's what that legislation really implies. And he said it the way he said it on Monday, because he's sending a signal, which does matter to the oil and gas sector, that we need to now stop making, you know, excuses, and to put it pejoratively, for why emissions have to keep going up a little bit more each year. This is the China model. And soon they'll start coming down on a curve towards zero and net zero 2050. It's time to start the curve now. And it's probably a good time to do it because the pandemic has slowed our economy, which means our emissions are actually lower probably this year and last year than they were a couple of years ago. So let's just capture that and let's start going down from here. Plus, there's a lot of technologies now becoming available to the energy sector, which the companies are all well aware of: hydrogen, CCUS, blending. You know, there's a variety of electrification, of course, of production. So there's a lot of tools maturing and becoming available to countries in the energy sector. And it's time for them to start choosing them. That's the signal. And you know, the 5 biggest oil companies in Canada have already endorsed net zero 2050 as a group.
That's what I wanted to ask Velma about. I mean, we've seen in the past an announcement like that, you know, ignites traditional friction between the West and Ottawa. Are we past that now, or has the potential just to set us back on a path that we've seen many, many times before?
Well, I think we're on less of a political seesaw. I think we're going to have a really heated debate, but it's a good debate. It's the necessary debate. It's the debate that's happening in every country. So one of the things that's worth noting about what happened when the Prime Minister said that is he also released a letter that Ministers Guilbeault and Wilkinson working together, because it hasn't always been the case in this country that the Ministers of Environment and NRCan work together. Lots of stories to tell there, but they have written to the Net Zero Advisory Council and said, okay, give us some specific things, give us some real things. The other thing that's different now is that this business about private sector money and public sector money, they understand that they're going to start to work together. So the federal government has put billions of dollars on the table around the net zero accelerator, around electric vehicle infrastructure, around investments in battery technology. All of that money is there, and it's a question. And you know, frankly, in all the conversations that we're having inside the government, we hear very pointed questions coming out of officials that say, can you demonstrate emissions reductions and significant emissions reductions for us by 2030? So yes, it's yes, there will be political tensions. I'm sure that the volleys back and forth from Alberta and Saskatchewan to Ottawa are going to be there, but I also know that the technology conversations, the conversations that those premiers are having with the private sector and with global finance, because it's all about capital investment, those are pointed conversations, and it's not just political back and forth. It's like, this is the real deal. Everybody has to get serious about this. So is it going to be tense? Yes, but it's necessary.
The industry leaders.
Any questions from viewers there that you want to raise for the panel?
Well, one question has to do with nuclear and the seeming, I guess, mixed messages about nuclear from the delegation in Glasgow.
Rick, I mean, you work on this file all the time. Why don't you lead in that, and then we'll go to Velma and back to Bud.
Well, there are mixed messages because there are mixed views about nuclear power, and just being reflected here as they are within the Canadian government. Obviously, Minister Guilbeault has a couple of times taken the opportunity to point out that wind and solar are less expensive than nuclear power, which isn't entirely true, depending on how you count it. Because nuclear power operates 90% of the time, and wind and solar operate 20% and 30% of the 35% of the time. So, what are you counting? But never mind that. The different parts of the country have different views on this. And Quebec and BC, for instance, Manitoba, Newfoundland have incredible amounts of hydropower. Why should they look at something like nuclear power? Ontario and Alberta and Saskatchewan don't. And so they need to look at something, the thing called baseload electricity. There's only a few ways to produce that stuff where you turn on the switch and decide how much of it you take. Nuclear is one of them, hydro is one of them usually. And natural gas is another, coal is one, but we're phasing it out quickly now. So, wind and solar, you don't decide when you're getting how much of it. Nature does. And they're great. They're great.
Minister Guilbeault might not be a big fan of nuclear. I remember that the former Minister of Natural Resources, Seamus O'Regan, said, you cannot solve this problem without nuclear.
He said that, and the Prime Minister said yesterday when he was asked about his minister's views, who was standing next to him at the news conference here in Glasgow, when he was asked this question, the Prime Minister said, all the options are on the table. We've got a big job to do here. If we're serious about getting to net zero, we're not going to preclude anything that can make a contribution. Some of the provinces, he said, are interested in SMR, small modular reactors, and he's going to let people look at those technologies and judge whether or not they can make the kind of contribution that's necessary to get to our targets. That's the way he put it. I'm paraphrasing, of course.
A parallel question to Velma on renewables, because what we've seen recently in China and also in Europe is a shortage of energy because the renewables that were available were not replacing traditional fossil fuels. Is that reflected at all in the conversations you're hearing in Glasgow right now?
Sure, we're going through a transition, and so wind companies and solar companies are understanding that when they're starting to operate at scale, there are challenges that they haven't experienced before. So this is what a transition in our energy system looks like, and the role of renewables and the role of batteries is massive. And so we're going to see these kinds of tensions. And in the short term, yes, we're gonna, there's going to be some places where it's a little bit pinchy, but that's just part of the transition. And it's not like we haven't experienced that before with, look at Alberta's electricity system and changes that have happened there. So,
Bud, you want to add to this part of the conversation at all?
Well, I think it's important to remember that, yes, this transition is going to be challenging. I mean, the incredible investments to move our electricity system off of fossil fuels is a long-term effort, and there will be supply disruptions. There's going to be supply disruptions in the components of silicon panels and of wind turbines that almost all come from China. So we have to be aware that, and maybe this is something which I think some leaders at Glasgow have said, we need to be a bit more on our front foot in terms of taking this as a huge challenge. It's not seamless. Tomorrow you turn on the lights and this big transformation has happened. This actually requires hard work, may require pain in some areas. And so the kinds of challenges we're seeing need to be mitigated, but they're not one-offs.
Yeah, Allan, sorry, can I just also mention, because there are also some interesting initiatives going on where countries and companies are working together to say, can we shorten the time frame to a transition? So whether it's fossil fuels or something else, but can we shorten the time frame and ramp up? And they're actually looking at the ramp up period. What would we do specifically? And this is the kind of ingenuity that will make those changes. So instead of taking 15 years, maybe we take 8 or 7, or etc.
Wouldn't that make the Chinas and the Russias and the Indians hysterical? They're saying 2060, 2070.
Sure, but
2050.
But let's just acknowledge what happens in these global target setting exercises. People say, I mean, this is one of the things that Nigel Topping, who's the guy who's leading on behalf of the UK government, the breakthrough agenda, is we say it's going to take us 20 years to do something, and then we put human ingenuity and we put our shoulder to the wheel and we put a little bit of capital and expertise into it, and it actually takes half as long. That has happened massively on a number of things. The price of renewables has come down quickly. The uptake in electric vehicles happened more quickly than happened. There's some master's business MBA studies out there that will show you that you set the target, you say 2060, and then when people actually start doing like what we see happening here, it takes a little bit less time than people imagine.
We should not be confused, though, about China. You know, they have a problem with coal plants. They're still building coal plants. They're still continuing to grow coal electricity emissions. But in almost every other sector, they're on the opposite trajectory. They're the biggest manufacturer and buyers of electric vehicles. The biggest, they have the most construction going on of nuclear reactors. They're installing more wind and solar power installations than anybody else in the world. You know, China is looking for some room to continue building, which I don't know if they should be doing, more coal plants and put them into production. And then they say when they get the other capacity that I was just referring to up to speed, they'll close those coal plants. Now that's a country where they can decide to close things like coal plants before they reach their natural end of their economic life. You know, it's a command and control economy. They can just do that. In our economy, it's hard to do that. That's the plan they're on. And so they've got a problem still with coal and the emissions associated with that. But in all the rest of their economy, they're pretty ahead of us in terms of the pace of that activity. And also it's true of the United States. We could kind of look at Washington and say, no, carbon price and so on. But, you know, the United States is reducing its emissions faster than Canada. The 11 states that are part of the carbon pricing system that they do have represent about a third of the economy. They're growing hydrogen vehicles and electric vehicles faster than we are so far, but we're going to change that, I think, now with the new legislation that we've talked about. So the United States is not a monolithic thing. It's the United States. And there are a lot of states, you know, they're phasing out coal just as quickly as we are, even though there is no national policy to do so. And in fact, there was a president for 4 years that opposed that. But the curve of closing coal electricity plants continued abate. It just ignored the president and carried on. Why? Because people in those states where the coal plants are operating don't want them operating there anymore. They don't want the local pollution. They don't want the climate pollution and so on. So there are things going on even in the countries where we consider them to be maybe behind the curve that are different from people's imagination. And China is right at the top of that list. Saudi Arabia is another interesting example.
I want to bring Bud in here on especially the U.S. record. I suggested earlier that Biden's green plan was gutted. Rick is saying something quite different because of the kind of bi-level relationship of governments, national versus state, that in fact, the United States is making great progress. For the first time, their goals are higher, their emission goals are higher than Canada's for 2030. You want to talk to me about that situation?
Well, for sure, you know, the movement away from natural gas the movement away from coal, I should say, in the United States is due to very significant restrictions on emissions of what would be called criteria pollution, you know, lead and things like that out of the smokestacks. And these are old factories, old power plants. So you shut that down, you replace it with a combined cycle gas turbine, right? Which is still emitting, but it emits a lot more cleanly. And so, yes, that's happening. The market's driving that. There's still a lot of stuff in the background, and particularly the infrastructure money that's contained in the bipartisan infrastructure bill and in the reconciliation bill. Trillions upon, well, in total, about $1 trillion worth of infrastructure improvements that are intended to drive climate improvements. So there is a lot happening at the federal level. There's a lot happening at the state level. But the U.S. was also starting from a pretty low bar in terms of having an electricity sector that was largely coal-fired, about 50% even until just a couple of years ago. So it's an easier lift. The abatement curve, cost curve, is a lot lower for the United States than it is for Canada.
Velma, you want to talk about the international front? I mean, China and Russia didn't bother to show up to the leaders section? I mean, what kind of effect does that have on the discussions today?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously disappointing to the leaders, but trust me, they're in the negotiating rooms. They're making their presence felt in lots of other ways. And as Rick said, he's just given, the survey of what's actually happening in China, because often their geopolitics puts them in a position where they negotiate in a particular way, and then across their 5-year plans, they do something quite different. So they are advanced on a lot of technologies uptakes. And let's be honest about that. That's because their citizenry is not happy with the quality of life that they experience because of pollution and other things. So that is in response to a domestic population, and they are being driven by that, and they will continue to be driven there. I mean, Russia's interesting because the question around their forests is really significant. And I think while Putin isn't here, I think he's felt the pinch of climate change a little bit more in the last 2 to 3 years, and especially through the pandemic, than he has in a while. I mean, look, this is all of the above. It takes a little while. Like I said, some people have got 2070 targets. Some people have got 2060 targets. The truth about Paris and the brilliance of the Paris Agreement is that it committed us all to every 5-year reviews and increasingly stringent targets. And now we have a net zero by 2050 horizon. So is somebody going to say, like, maybe there's a political change in Russia and then they're on track for 2050? So like, this is not a one and done kind of conversation. This is with us for the rest of our lives. Our children will be having this conversation. And, I do want to give a shout out, because this is the COP where the youth voice is really heard, inside the building and outside the building. Because of course, Greta Thunberg is here. She's not in the COP. She's not there as a delegate. She doesn't go in the building. And she has a low opinion of what's happening in the building.
Blah, blah, blah.
Blah, blah, blah. Yes. She has a low opinion of what's happening in the building. But the truth is that leadership happens inside that building and outside that building. And so the kinds of things that we're hearing from, because women's organizations, this is also, we're living at a moment when the question of an inclusive society, we're on the other side of a pandemic. Our ability to live in an inclusive world is also being discussed here. The role of women, the role of the Indigenous organizations, who have a worldview that actually ties them much more inherently, internally, to a strong stewardship relationship with the land. But the youth voice is very loud and very clear, and it's their future that we're talking about here. So it's about time.
I want to shift gears a little bit. It's kind of related to the nuclear question, Rick, that there's also what's been referred to as kind of the Bill Gates suite of solutions. And that is using not just kind of will and regulation and pricing, but technology to get us out of this bind. How much of the conversation over the next 9 days is going to be devoted to technological breakthrough and the kind of investments needed in technology that doesn't even exist today that will assist in the reduction of emissions?
Well, most of it is about that, Alan. I mean, the negotiations here are about the Paris rule book, which is an important piece of everything else that we're talking about, and probably a little bit too technical and boring for us to really get into. But it really, the term Article 6, Google that and you'll find out what it's about and why it's important for Canada. But that's not, we're not negotiating the technologies, they're just emerging. And we're talking about how to finance them and how to encourage them and so on. So all around the conference, there's a trade show with lots of booths and so on, people representing all these companies and sectors and so on, and countries who are hosting these sectors and incubating them and so on. And so you see all kinds of people here, from large and small clean tech companies, large and small clean energy companies, busy cutting deals. They come here for that. And so there's the restaurants, you can't in Glasgow book a dinner table because guess what people are doing? They're doing business outside the conference. They're doing business all day at the conference. And that part of the show has gotten to be bigger than the negotiating part of it amongst governments, bigger in terms of scale, but not necessarily more important.
Bud, we
Alan,
talked a little bit
there's a
about the
question
division.
from,
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
there's
Go
a
on.
question from Jim Dinning, I think, that fits into what Rick was just asking. So
The Jim Denning?
The Jim Dinning, I think. Technology innovation is the answer, then what's the objective? Is it elimination of emissions or elimination of fossil fuels?
It's well, that's a debate. I think it's the elimination of emissions. And so the challenge for the emitting industries like the oil and gas industry is can you get to net zero? Can you produce oil and use oil in a way that's consistent with net zero principles? You can find engineers who say that. I know a lot of people will just roll their eyes and say, well, that's not possible. But that's what the challenge is for the industry. So it's a technology challenge, as Alan put it, but it's to reduce emissions. It's not to eliminate not to prejudge things and eliminate a particular sector. This is going to be hard for the transportation sector too. It's going to be hard for agriculture. It's going to be hard for building operators. But the technologies are there to do this. And so how does the oil and gas sector do that? It's probable that we won't be using oil the same way 30, 40, 50 years from now as we are today.
You want to jump in there, Velma? To Jim's question?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I just like to draw attention to is that one of the things that is happening inside the building is that we are creating a global set of agreements and infrastructure so that the whole planet can move together on climate. So the Paris rule book is there, this stuff around the High Ambition Coalition, the things that they're pushing, and they're doing the same things on technology. So there are breakthrough initiatives on technology that are mobilizing private sector capital into the kinds of technologies that help us hit a 2050 target. Because when we look out over that 30-year horizon, we need technologies that are deployed at a level that are not in evidence today. And the only way we're going to do that is if we work together, and we need to mobilize them in both developed and developing. And so like the negotiation, what Rick is saying is right. There are deals being done. There are technology folks who are here. There are people who are talking about how they accelerate the deployment of their technologies, or for instance, in the airline sector, how we're going to deal with a national sector where that's a very hard to abate sector. It's very hard to get emissions reductions in that sector. So those kinds of conversations are happening here, but without a global architecture for how we're going to work together and move global north and global south, we're just not going to get this done.
Well, let me ask Bud about that, because in Paris 2015, I mean, the developed world agreed to spend $100 billion in the developing countries to help them deal with mitigating strategies and projects. Failed to raise that amount. You mentioned Minister Wilkinson, in fact, got it over the line just this year. Are the wealthy countries finally at a stage where they're prepared to say this is a global problem? And as Velma said, the solution has to be global. We have to bring those countries forward who can't afford to do that as on their own. And that's our responsibility. That's on us. Are we there yet?
The rhetoric is, and I think the dollars will follow. One of the key differences, I think, now is that $100 billion a year, through multilateral developed banks and peer-to-peer sharing or whatever, country to country, the idea is that de-risks the private sector investment of the $4 trillion barrel over here. I mean, Larry Fink from BlackRock was just saying this the other day, look, that should be the model. And so I think there's actually success around the corner. If the financials can line up, you have that $100 billion de-risking things in small island states. You have a private sector coming in and making that significant, substantial follow-on investment. I think there's a solution there.
Listen, this tyranny of time is upon us. So I want to ask each of you before we wind this up. I mean, Velma, I reread something that you wrote after the Paris 2015 conference, and you were really gunned up. I mean, you saw that as a really kind of landmark conference. What's the yardstick this time? What does success look like? What do they have to come out of this conference with to say we're moving in the right direction?
Well, the highest possible ambition and an understanding that each country has to do its part, whatever that is, right? And they're going to take and tally up the the numbers that everybody puts forward for their national ambition, and they're gonna say, does it get us to 1.5? The IPCC said that we needed a 45% reduction in emissions by 2030 in order to have a hope of 1.5. And so the other thing I like, we talk about this like it's a bunch of, there's a bunch of very passionate people here, particularly from small island states. It's 1.5 to stay alive. Those people are here. Someone from the president of Palau said, if you're really not going to do anything about this, then you should just bomb us today, because that's what you're commissioning us to the end of our civilization, the end of our country, because we'll be underwater by the time you people get this
Marshall
together.
Islands, Seychelles, they're all.
Yeah, Marshall Islands, like you go through the list. The small island states are a very impassioned group, and they are making the case that the acceleration in the next decade is everything, because we will not hit these targets. It's not a slow slope out to 2050. It's a big jump down, and then we can start to see other kinds of emissions. So that is the benchmark. It has to be real. It has to be implementation. This is a conference about implementation and a recognition that some people are already living with adaptation. Mitigation is not a question for them. It's about adaptation. So that will be the benchmark.
What about for you? What is the yardstick for success here?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, that people follow through on what they say they're going to do here. I think this conference is already largely successful in its stated goals of raising the ambition level and turning ambition into concrete plans. I think that work has been done pretty well over the last 6 or 12 months. And Mark Carney's done an exceptional job pulling that financial alliance together, which is one of the biggest new additions to the exercise, as well as the raising of goals and the fashioning of more concrete plans. But I think that's kind of done as the conference got underway, and it's slowly getting announced on its different days, on the different theme days and so on. But it's where do they go from here? Can they finish the Paris rule book? Because without that $4 trillion of investment is going to be harder to unleash, right? I mean, the rule book means, how do we count things? How do we avoid double counting things? So when Mark Carney and his gang get together and say, 200 financial institutions will align our investing with net zero objectives, how do we count net zero? What does net mean? So those people are going to bring, for that to work, they're going to be asking for the financial discipline that answers those questions. They're not just going to throw money into a pot and then explain to their shareholders, their pension funds and so on, that the money didn't get made because it turned out that we didn't understand what we're investing in, because the rules about that industry were not clear. So they're going to hold people's feet to the fire. That's not just free money. And I think that's a healthy thing. There's a carrot and a stick there. The carrot is, we're ready to invest in this. The stick is, you need to make sure the rules are well understood and that we can explain it to the beneficiaries, the pension beneficiaries and so on, our shareholders that we're accountable to. So I think that's, to see all of that play out at the conference and beyond is where I think the yardsticks of success lie.
Final word to Bud. What are you looking for in the next 9 days? What's an important signal for you?
I think an acknowledgement that to unleash the $4 trillion of capital, there will be engagement by financial regulators, that the ESG metrics that unleashes the capital, that's the mechanism you're going to figure out where you are going to get a return that is actually sustainable, et cetera. That there needs to be a doubling down on efforts to define and describe and characterize those ESG metrics for the future of finance to flow appropriately.
Well, that's it for us. Velma, Rick, Bud, I want to thank you very much for joining me. It's been a great conversation. To those who tuned in, thank you all. If we hadn't get to your question, we will write you back. Personally, we'll also send you a link to this conversation. We are going to regroup on the 15th of November, same time at noon, once the conference winds up, and that we will continue the conversation. So to all, thank you very much. Be well and be safe.
And you see, I'm in a different time zone with the sun going down here. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Good night, everybody.